Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for everybody who's out there on different time zones. We sure appreciate you checking in with us today. This is episode 3 of Frankly Speaking, so we're super excited to have everybody join us. Before we get started here, I'd like to do a couple housekeeping items. So if you're on the line live with us here, if you could just on your GoToWebinar control panel there, give us a hand raise if you can hear us and see us just fine here on the screen. So with that, I'll be checking my GoToWebinar control panel. And let's see here.
Hello, hello.
We're seeing people, so great. Awesome to see everybody. And glad you're with us today. We have a super exciting episode. I think exciting anyway, when we start to talk about compliance, right? Really fun stuff. But with that, my name is Frank Gurnee. I am one of your Franks here, and with me as well, I have Frank Raimondi, who is somewhere in the world. I don't know, where are you today, Frank?
I'm in Vegas today, so you know, everybody in the industry is going to be in Vegas at some point during the year, at least once. So I'm here for
it's kind of like
Partners Expo.
It's kind of like anywhere in the world because Vegas, literally.
Yeah, it's a little bit. Yeah, it depends on what part of the strip you're on. You could be in a different country, in a different continent, at least theoretically.
Yeah, March sounds like a great time to be there.
Well, it's gonna be 90 degrees today, so we'll see what
no, that's not bad for Vegas. Dry heat, right? They say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, very good. Yeah. We have some special guests with us today, and I'm super excited to introduce these guys because they bring such a wealth of knowledge to this conversation. First and foremost, we have Matthew Fisch, who is founder of FortMesa. He also has the long-running MSP Cyber Roundtable podcast. If you haven't heard it, subscribe, guys. Really awesome. Thanks for being here, Matt, today. We really appreciate it, and we'll get some info from you as well. We have Brian Doyle, who is the co-founder of vCIOToolbox, really cool solution. And Frank's been on your podcast, right? So the MSP Business School
a couple times now.
Yeah,
and we got to give a shout out to Matt as well. You know, Matt's been on there at least once.
Oh, awesome. Well, I guess I'm the only one who has not been on. So.
You're next, Frank. You know, hey, you've only been around for a little while.
Well, you're coming up on 5 years, right? Is that what I heard?
Yeah, we're coming up on 5 years, but you're not coming up on 5 years with Nodeware yet. So now we'll get you on.
That's true. Although I've been in the industry almost, I don't know, 20 some years. So it's all good. But Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, about what you bring as far as expertise and all that good stuff?
Well, sure. So I sort of grew up in the service provider space, really. My first gig out of school was enterprise IT and like working side by side with, and they weren't MSPs at that time, back in around 2000, but working with a solution provider as that external reach into the co-managed environment, and then struck out on my own, work with a bunch of providers, ran my own practice. But several years ago decided, hey, this security practice I've been building, working with service providers, something's happening in the industry that's a little bit different. So this was back in, like the 2018 range. And really the pressures that had been up in large enterprise started trickling down, mid-enterprise, small businesses. And we now in 2020, 2025, 2024, last year, there's a compliance need across every vertical, every business size. There is some, not only is there compliance requirements, but what's emerged is a whole language to speak to your clients about cybersecurity investments in a way that's actually a little bit more familiar to a business manager than talking about security tools. So that's sort of what led me to the creation of FortMesa. So we're focused on specifically that space, engaging with end clients and service providers that are using those tools of compliance language to get people right-sized into their security investments, and then of course evidence them. And technically we exist in the category of product called GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. But as we do work primarily with service providers. We're super focused on how do you sell that? How do you get the client to invest at the right level? So that's where we are. Um,
Yeah.
and
And Matt, I think
yeah, go
well,
ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think and maybe we'll do it as a deeper topic, but I think one of the things I was gonna ask you as you were kind of referring there is this the dog wagging the tail, wagging the dog relative to insurance, right? And cyber insurance is kind of have a big play in this, right? And are they just commingling, or are they one driving the other? So we'll talk about that after when we get into the
Yeah.
discussion. But
Yeah,
that was the first thing I was
yes,
thinking about. It's like, okay,
I
what's
go
really driving
really fun
this?
place. Yeah, and I love this kind of fireside chat kind of idea or way we're doing this. And I think you guys both do this in your podcast where we can really just kind of jive off different things, right? That makes sense. But I appreciate that, Matt. And then before we move to Brian here, do you have a famous Frank that you're
Well,
aligned with?
you guys asked, and the only one I could think of was Frank Herbert. So I went deep into Dune. It seems forever ago, but I remember wearing like shades of brown for weeks as I I went through the full series. Um, and apparently my head's still there.
Okay, tells
I
us
love
a
it. Well,
lot. Thank you.
We always like to align ourselves with some Frank out there, which since this is the Frankly Speaking podcast here. But Brian, with that, I'd love for you to introduce yourself. Let us know what you do and give us a little background.
Sure. So, Brian Doyle, similar to Matt, I've been in the MSP industry for quite some time, hence the gray hair, right? Cut my teeth starting in MSP back in 2001, and really focused on cloud technologies as things evolved there, as well as the traditional monitoring and maintenance of the time back in that day. As we were fortunate enough to have a successful exit around 2010, and that gave me an opportunity to be a hired gun and really go out and build some data centers as well in my next organization and cater to the mid-market. And that's where the compliance story starts intersecting here. We were routinely going through our own, SOC, or at that point in time was SSA 18 type 2 and those kind of assessments, and preparing our customers' reports as well as it relates to our data center and their usage of our data center going hand in hand into their audits as well. So compliance has kind of been a story within my side. I probably come more from the business end of compliance than the technical end of compliance, understanding all the pen testing and those reports, in great detail. But as I came out of that, and as you would expect, it comes with a little bit of a non-compete when I left that hired gun role. We started building a virtual CIO consulting practice. And in doing that, we saw the similar things that Matt alluded to. There was something going on with the customers. They needed more. We took our process and productized it into what became the first generation of vCIOToolbox, and really focused on the quarterly business review world where they were looking at day-to-day operations and security, and then building roadmaps and guiding customers more from a business lens to run their operations. We always had eyes on getting more involved on the compliance side, though, and really we're waiting for the market to catch up. And we could probably talk a little bit about this when everybody felt that inflection point. Sounds like, Matt, you might have felt it a little bit earlier than we did. We really saw it was around 22, 23 where the compliance started coming into vogue. And that's when we launched our Cyberant suite of GRC tools, which really allows us to bring those two worlds together, the business review and the account management side with the GRC side, integrate those POAMs into the roadmap, integrate everything into a single risk strategy, and then really go out to our customers and try to move the needle and help them better protect themselves. We think about it more as like a cyber program as much as we think about the compliance side of things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
that's
that's an
awesome.
interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to add, just thinking about our product, right, in terms of a nodeware or other vulnerability tools. Vulnerability sort of assessments, kind of used to be just a once a year, you did it, you checked the box, yeah, I was compliant. And so, now it's becoming much more driven into the things. And so maybe both Matt and Brian, are there, beyond vulnerability management, what are you seeing? And maybe part of this is kind of in the proactive front, and some of it is in sort of the reactive front. But what are the other tools are kind of really becoming, the required elements within compliance and compliancy?
Well, so you mentioned vulnerability management. When we began to productize, keep in mind that my practice to that point, before we began to productize, before FortMesa became FortMesa, we were working with service providers that had the most, they were the hungriest, right? They were the hungriest for cyber compliance. We were going in with advisory services, and they had a lot of the pieces in place that compliance standards are still asking for. But they needed a strategy to wrap all of that up. As small businesses began knocking on their service providers' doors with they're hearing about compliance requirements that have now been drilled into their heads for more than 5 years now. It doesn't matter what type of small or medium business you are, you go to a networking event, there is some guy on stage talking about cyber, right? And so service providers began hearing about this and calling people like us and saying, well, what should we be doing? These are service providers that never previous to that point had asked about compliance. And so we bring them to a standard and we look at the things, right? And asset management. Okay, good. We got an RMM for that, right? And the next thing on the list is vulnerability management. And I'm going to tell you, this is a few years ago. Um, Typically, most service providers had not used any type of vulnerability scanning with their clients in any kind of mechanical way. They may have theoretically been exposed to that tool at one point. Maybe they did annual scans or something. They had really no sustainable practices in place. So that's been, and I'm sure you guys are feeling it, like this new movement in the industry around that practice that really didn't exist before.
Absolutely.
And training, a lot of attention to training. I think the earliest version of this we saw that landed on the scene was, the phishing simulation stuff, but that's the little baby version of awareness training. When really, end clients need to be trained on how to deal with someone demanding like some information over the phone, and they get angry, right? How do you deal with that situation? What is the user responsibility? What should you do when you see a little warning on your screen, right? There's a lot of stuff that people need to be trained in. How to recognize an incident. How do you know when something's crossed the line of reportability and now you need to tell someone else about this thing? Oops, I clicked on a link, right? Um,
Yeah.
so that whole tool suite, right? Clearly, we've seen EDR changing the MSP space over the last 10 years, right? But I think we all know about that. What I think the space is still grappling with is the response aspect to that, right? And how do we turn that into a managed response, right? And I think we're still working there. And I think if you want to ask me what's coming next, I think we're going to see a lot more tooling and investments in the life cycle governance of an incident, because there's a very specific way that service providers need to interact with incidents to protect their clients and protect and of course also respond to the legal and insurer requirements. And it's challenging. It's
Yeah.
challenging
Yeah,
to do the right thing.
yeah. I think insurance is going to push a lot of that, but yeah. And with that, Brian, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are around, I mean, obviously there's this, tech stack, and it's ever evolving and changing. Just like, I mean, it's so funny because you guys have all been around since the early days of MSP, right? And to me, it's so parallel with those days when we went to events and it was all RMM and PSA and BDR and so on and so forth. It was so much similarity in what's happening in the industry. But with all of that being said, Brian, so like, I think of these buckets, or Matthew Koenig actually from our from Nodeware actually put this pretty well. He created this triangle of proactive, reactive, and testing, basically being the kind of buckets that you would put your tool set in. And obviously proactive being something that you need to be doing initially, probably sits front of stack. Reactive, things like EDR, MDR, things like that. And then testing, like pen testing and so on. But I know that you guys really believe in and truly feel, so do I, that assessments and risk assessment and that sort of thing is like kind of the first step in any of these compliance process. But what do you think as far as bringing all these tool sets together. And when we talk about for MSPs, where do they start, right? What do they need to do?
Well, Frank, you just kind of touched upon it with that last statement. There's a lot of people and process that goes with the systems that have to be part of these programs as well. And certainly while we got the tool stack and Matt hit upon most of the common tools that you need to protect yourself, your vulnerability scanners, your EDRs, all those kind of things, what you really got to almost do is take a reverse look at it and go, all right, if I'm really going to be audited, if I'm held to a compliance standard, I'm going to need to have evidence, right? And what is the evidence that I need to produce? And then what tools can help me automate that evidence? And then what evidence am I going to have to still do by rolling up my sleeves and getting the job done with my team? And that would tend to be more your policy and procedure type work. So, really, I think when you think about the security stack, it's everything that Matt, alluded to. You got to get those core tools that are going to help protect you, automate. But if nobody's watching it, if nobody's reviewing it, and if nobody's proving out that the store's being locked and things aren't coming through, it's really tough to prove compliance. Thus, also, and Frank, to your point with cyber insurability, ensure your claims are going to get paid or not have any carve outs.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's weird, right? Because I think of this like when we look at tool sets and we look at MSPs, you tend to like go towards the technical, right? And the reality is when we talk about compliance, it's a lot of process, paperwork, documentations, all of this kind of stuff, which is not necessarily also technical, right? It might have technical aspects to it, but really policies and procedures and this kind of stuff is not necessarily the stuff that's known. So how do we kind of get our heads around being that, doing that stuff for clients when we're really technically focused? Any thoughts there?
I talk about this almost every day with some service provider. And the basic way that I boil it down is that it's not really paperwork versus tools. What we're really talking about is technology versus people. And we don't all have like chips implanted in our heads, so you can't install a tool into our wetware, right? So when it comes to dealing with people, which by the way, the people and what people do is about 2/3 of cybersecurity. The tools and the things that you can install and buy and use, it's about 1/3 of cybersecurity. So how do you talk about what your people and processes do, right? And how do you prove it in the future when you're in a scenario where you have to evidence that you guys did the right things? When it comes to tools, there's all this forensic trails that are left behind, right? But if you're not documenting what people are doing, you don't have planning processes, you don't have any repeatability, you don't have policies written, right? Then you really have no proof that your people, which is 2/3 of cybersecurity, are doing the right thing. And so I think that there's this tendency in the technical world to hear the word compliance and think about a stack of paper, right? And what really needs to be understood is that we're not talking about the paper, we're talking about what you people do. And unfortunately, paper is one of the easiest ways to evidence that. So having systems that your people can interact with that leave a paper trail is really important. And that does not mean exporting some technical report out of a technical tool. Unfortunately, there's too much that happens up here and that happens in conversation between people that really needs to get formalized. And so that's the nature of compliance. But actually, that's while many technology providers have a hard time with that, businesses have no problem with that. You talk to a small business, medium enterprise, they get it. Most of what they do is people, right? So it's, I think,
Yeah.
the easiest way to talk about cybersecurity with a client is all of that stuff, all that people process stuff, what you're going to be doing as a service provider. And so when it comes to compliance, what we're really talking about is how do all the people and processes and tools work together, right?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah,
I'm
Brian, you
going
had
to
a
take
thought?
Yeah, I'm going to take this from a little different bent, right? And it's more about the MSP providing these services, right? And the resources that they have on their team. There's also always been this kind of common feeling in the MSP community. I got a really good tech, I can make them do anything, right? And there's that posture. But really, it takes a different personality to deliver these services and understand these services, similar to the conversations we've always had on the vCIO side, which is, this isn't as much a technical talk as it is a business talk. So an MSP, when they're going to go into these services, really has to evaluate their own staff and say, do I have the right person that can carry this compliance torch? Are they willing to do non-technical things, right? A lot of the true VCSOs love to roll up their sleeves and dig in and work with the tools. Do they have that other acumen that they can work with teams, get policy done, drive that policy and ensure it's being delivered, the procedures are being followed, many of the things that Matt spoke to. And if you don't have those resources, where are you going to go to get them, right? Because you're still going to need to address that conversation with your customer if you want to keep them long term. But you also don't want to put yourself in a position where you're not doing right by them because you don't really know those resources, you don't have those resources on staff. So, I interpreted the question a little bit differently, but hopefully that gives you a little lens into, thinking about your team and staffing before you go out there and do it.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think that it does take a different type of person to be that vCISO type to really want to deep dive and maybe even fits kind of a lot of the business owners who are sometimes less technical, although we have business owners of every type in an MSP, right? You have highly technical and then you have more business focused, but maybe it fits more into that business focused type of personality to take on that vCISO role, at least initially. And when we talk about smaller MSPs, obviously the larger ones can hire a vCISO or bring someone on board who has that kind of background.
Yeah. And if you broaden it a little bit, think about it as advisory as a whole. We have a responsibility as an MSP to consult to our customers in a variety of ways, compliance being one of them, right? So if you borrow from the enterprise that concept of the office of CIO and make an office of vCIO, if you want to call it that, it really needs different roles in there: an executive sponsor, the day-to-day operator, the person that's managing the technology, the person that's managing the compliance, and together they have to bring those solutions and work upward to make sure that they then drive into what the company standards and the company process and policies are.
Yeah, for sure.
One of the things I was just thinking when you were saying that, Brian, was I'm kind of curious what you guys are seeing from current users about this. Where does compliance sort of hit, right? With some the business size, right? I mean, it really should be whether you're 5 people or 500 people or more, but where are you kind of seeing, most of your people, kind of businesses are they dealing with when dealing with compliance?
I mean, they tend to be upper small, lower medium on up, right, when they really get into compliance requirements. But I've seen all comers, and I'm sure Matt will speak to this too. We live, I live not too far away from UTC and Sikorsky, right? And there are people that deliver one screw for a Blackhawk that now need to adhere to certain regulations. I also am near the, near the hedge fund market. And when you start looking at those markets, they could be really small companies handling big dollars and definitely need to adhere to a compliance story as well. So, there's no singular shape and size. Yes, it tends to be upper S and lower M for the most part, right? But there are these niches, and these are real huge opportunities because these are clients that the MSPs are working with today that they can jump in and potentially broaden their reach, from a security and compliance standpoint. Matt, I turn it to you.
Yeah, I think I see this as I see this as a spectrum, really, because we have the traditional compliance implementations that they've been around for decades, right? And they've been growing. They've been growing in recent years, and they've been expanding across verticals, different as you said, like the government supply chain, right? It's going all the way up the supply chain now. However, when I say a spectrum, what I mean is that actually there's been a big transition in the psyche of a business owner over the last 10 years. Unless you've been hiding under a whole pile of rocks, you've picked up 30 newspapers where cyber was the front page story. And you go to conferences and you talk to other business owners that are seeing losses, and you're talking to your insurers and you're talking to your lawyers, and everyone's talking about cyber. And so while the formalized exercises that result in, as an example, when we do a risk assessment in our advisor practice, it's 50-page executive summary, a couple hundred pages of supplementary evidence is going into that deep risk assessment. That's not happening in small business, right? But what is happening in small business is when you talk to that small business owner using compliance language, talking about the compliance requirements that are in their vertical, in their geography, which, by the way, cover every business, not just some businesses. Those small business owners, all of a sudden, instead of feeling afraid of cybersecurity problems, they now feel informed and they can make good investment decisions. And when your client is making an informed decision to invest in cybersecurity, that really results in a quality relationship building between you and your client. When you sell them on a cybersecurity tool because you scared them, right? That there was no trust built there, right? They bought the thing because they were scared. They may or may not still be scared, but that doesn't mean they're going to trust you on the next security conversation unless you can scare them again, right? So I think that compliance language is everywhere, and the formalized paper stack exercises have been growing. And clearly, if you're in that part of the market, you're a service provider dealing with mid-enterprise. There's a lot of project work available there, and risk assessments are a great way to get those co-managed clients right-sized. But I think down in the fully managed practice space, small business space, the way you should be talking to your clients is with compliance terminology, not security terminology.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, that's
one
a
of the
good point. Go ahead, Frank.
I was just saying, I think part of that the explanation is great, Matt. And one of my kind of questions I come up with, or I've heard a number of times. So what's really the difference between compliance and being compliant, right? And maybe in those small businesses, as part of the discussion, you can say, hey, you might not have specific compliance requirements, but if you were to grow or if you went into this business, you are going to need to be compliant on these. So I don't know if that's a discussion point or if it kind of just is.
Well,
Maybe it's.
I'm just gonna I'll try to keep it short. So I'm a security geek, clearly, right? And I'm not a compliance guy, right? I found my way to compliance as a way to talk about the important security things that need to happen. Um,
Right.
and I think if the conversation is about being compliant, the mentality is I'm ticking boxes and not doing a thing,
Yep.
right? And then I'm
Okay.
ignoring it after I've ticked the box. The process of compliance is an ongoing activity, and that's what cybersecurity should be. Cybersecurity is a process that's ongoing and it does not stop. So you're either doing compliance work resulting in a compliant state, or you are not doing compliance work and you are not compliant.
Well, I love that.
Yeah.
We're going to quote that and kick that clip out there. That's a great educational piece right there. And Brian, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was going to say from my seat, it's really looking at the G, right? The governance side of this. And it's exactly what Matt was just expanding on there. It's getting the right processes in place, being able to measure that they're being effective, that you're able to prove out that you're getting this done, but really putting a foundation of cyber culture into your environment so people know that if they do click on that link, they should make somebody aware and not feel like they're going to get their lunch eaten as a result of this too, right? So when you look at it from the top down, that whole what is compliance versus compliant, I think it's more how do you get a culture going where people feel empowered to share when they make a mistake so it doesn't become a bigger problem for you, and how do you get the right processes, guardrails, and systems in place to help empower those people to make fewer mistakes, right? And that goes into the human side. Then the technical side will take care of itself, if you put the right assemblage of tools and have the right people at the helm, for each one of them understanding what they do.
Yeah. Well,
I think it's a
maybe
good
even
point.
just to. Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up that there is a ton of misconceptions and miseducation and misideas around compliance and cybersecurity. And I think the conversation is almost compliance versus cybersecurity, because the reality is they are two very different things, right? Cybersecurity in general is a way of doing all of these things and keeping, that could be done for anybody. Good cyber hygiene should be done for every single business, no matter what. Some businesses have very specific compliance requirements, but I came in around to cybersecurity around the time maybe you guys were all kind of talking about it in the 2021, 2022 kind of time frame when, I had heard a lot about compliance, but it was all surrounded around people educating around the opportunity of CMMC. And so to me, that wasn't really giving a good example of really what compliance was in general, because there's so many different compliance requirements. Either you got your HIPAA, FINRA, FTC safeguard, the list goes on, right? But with all of that being said, that difference between compliance and cybersecurity, and I think this is where we get so many MSPs that just don't understand that they should be doing these cyber practices for every one of their clients, not just for compliance requirement clients. So when we talk about all the things we all do, right, it's stuff that they should be doing for every one of their clients. And so can you guys separate that opportunity versus, what should be just standard practice at this point? Anybody got anything on that?
I could spend an hour on that one. Brian, why don't you go first?
Well, I could probably equally do that, but if you really look at that, right, it's one of those things that you got to look at what you have to do. You got to get your security stack in. You got to put those tools in that are going to give you the best opportunity to get things done. But where the opportunity grows, and what I see too many MSPs starting to give away for free, and they really need to productize it too, is going in and helping the customer shape their cyber programs and start looking at that governance layer and doing policy procedure, build outs with their clients or with their MSP customers as well. And, we see often, and Matt, I'd love you to weigh in on this too, but I'm seeing a lot of standardization at NIST CSF or CIS for those customers that aren't bound to regulatory compliance to help them with cyber insurability. But I'm seeing MSPs giving that away at no cost. And those are not short, they're time consuming activities and they really require a lot of interaction. So there's a huge opportunity here, without getting into that opportunity too deep, for productization of this, the compliance as a service, governance as a service role for a vCISO. And, hopefully we see more of the market moving that way. Matt, I turn it to you.
Well, if we rewind, not, really any time before now, we've really been led by the technology houses and the security houses on the product side to determine what a service provider is delivering in cybersecurity. And so in the MSP world, we've been led by big firewall, we've been led by big antivirus, big EDR, right, and some smaller vendors, right, and then we've really, as an industry, been letting them take charge. And what the resulting cybersecurity castle. Instead of looking like a wall, right, around your organization, you end up with like a 30-foot wall on one side and like no fourth wall. And I think when we want to distinguish between security or cybersecurity or information security and compliance work, I think we do use other terminology to talk about how do we determine what security we should have, right? Sometimes we talk about security architecture, and a cybersecurity framework and becoming compliant and having compliance work around that framework is a way of building cybersecurity architecture. And that's when you make sure that the security you've been implementing is secure all the way around, and not just secure all the way around, but that you built your cybersecurity program. And Brian used this word that I think is really important, the shape of a cybersecurity program, which literally we stick your cybersecurity program on radar charts and show you the shape of it, right? And if it's not a circle, what that means is you've got a back door open and or you're overspending in places. So people focus a lot on what they're not doing, but I think it's equally important to focus on where's your cybersecurity deployed that's a complete waste of money, because you may have a really cool tool installed, but the attackers don't care about where you're strong. They're going to look for that place and they're going to find where you're weak. And if you don't have a security architecture and you're not doing compliance work to make sure that's rounded, your clients are not protected and you're actually not doing security best practice. Now, I think Brian mentioned CIS and NIST as being frameworks for clients that don't have specific requirements, and that's a great point. And those are typically the recommendations I make for those organizations that don't have specific compliance requirements that they need to achieve. And so it's really important for the service provider to look at their stack and their people and processes and see, well, how are we doing on CIS? How are we doing on NIST? What are we doing for ourselves? What are we doing for our clients? And yeah, I think we should be selling security castle walls by the foot. Do you want a 6-foot wall around your organization, or do you want a 30-foot wall?
Yeah. Well, I was kind of bringing that into, sort of the other way to spell compliance and being compliant is prioritization, right? You got to know, again, it's that consultative discussion, right? It's not, it shouldn't be an MSP going into an account and saying, "Oh, you don't have any of this. You need that and that and that and that and that." But it's like, okay, I just see dollar signs, right? If I'm the customer. So it's really kind of back to maybe the assessment, right? Kind of looking, having let's call it a frank discussion, right? It's a frank discussion about where they, what they have, what walls do they have up, what walls don't they, and really make that a prioritization discussion, right? Rather than, hey, you need to do all this to be compliant. No, let's prioritize your safety. We're going to follow those things because they've been proven to be valuable to follow, right? Or the procedures and the policies, these are important. And you're missing this and this, so let's work on those.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that it's just a matter of time before everyone will have some type of standard compliance requirement. And the reason I think that truly is because, this is cyber attacks, cyber issues affect every individual, right? So all of us most likely on this call have received the letter that we've been breached through our credit card or through this or through that website or whatever. But the reality is it hits every single everyday American or anyone across the world. So the point with that is at some point it's going to come down to government regulating every single industry, doesn't matter who they are. We've already started to see that with the FTC safeguard rules around, very specific industries that are out there. But with all of that being said, I think it's the reason why you'd want to standardize the way you're doing your business around exactly, even if you're looking to frameworks like NIST to help you kind of, what are we doing that we can kind of, align ourselves with this in best practices and that sort of thing. I think that makes a ton of sense for an MSP to do that. But with all that being said, everybody is, again, hyper-focused on the tool set. And in managed services, we had a very standardized tool set, RMM, PSA, RMM, BDR, right, and AV. I mean, for the most part, you had your other things that were in there, but that is the standardized tool set. When will we get to that standardization around cyber for the MSP, where they know this is the tool set I need? I'm going to provide that for every one of my clients, no matter what.
Yep. Yeah.
Hey, never.
I sort of agree with Brian there. I don't think ever.
Yeah, no, that's the nirvana state, and it's just not going to happen. But again, it's back to the conversation, right? It is.
I do think it's getting vetted to a certain extent because, you're starting to see these things come out in front, right? Vulnerability management, it's just a requirement. You have to have it. Endpoint protection, you just have to have it. It's one of those things, right? And then, of course, there's going to be tons of tools and vendors with new stuff, just as there has been in the MSP space, no matter what. But to me, there's the standard set of tools or pieces that need to be there no matter what.
No, Frank, I think you're spot on in the sense that there's a standard set of tools and things that are being used in place today. My joke on that is we don't know what tomorrow's going to bring, right? We all see the question marks that are coming out of AI, and we're seeing frameworks being developed to help you manage that. But there may be tools that haven't even been invented yet and deployed that are going to help solve the security crisis that comes there. out of that point. I want to go back to what Raimondi said, since we have to use last names now, and go into the fact that you were talking about a little bit about prioritization, and I think now you're really talking about the risk story, right? We also have to look at, when we're looking at compliance as a whole with the customer, what are the risks they're facing, and which risks have the biggest impact and the biggest likelihood of occurring based on the way they're built, based on the way they operate. And that's going to guide you a little bit to where you need to spend those technology dollars or those training dollars as well. So, I'm a big fan of really starting out first with a risk analysis and then determining how to tie back to the framework there and really make sure that you're addressing the areas that you might not be identifying in your risk play. Matt, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, I would agree with you. I sometimes describe this, however, because risk is sort of a nebulous term.
Yep.
But I talk to and I coach service providers to talk to their end clients about return on investment. It's a much easier thing to understand return on investment for someone that understands they're not secure enough. They understand they have to make more investments. When you talk to them about ROI rather than size of risk, which is nebulous, all of a sudden those proposals, right, those solution proposals start to make more sense. When you tell the end client, hey, this thing has a really high return on investment because it's been prioritized, as Raimondi said, in the cybersecurity framework as being a foundational, high impact protective solution. And this other thing that maybe you've heard of before, super expensive, but doesn't actually provide a lot of protection, doesn't provide a lot of additional protection versus all this other stuff you're already doing. I think that ROI, that it helps, first of all, in the sales process, but I also think it's easier for a business manager to understand when you present both the risk and you talk about the investment as well, because that's how they think about everything in their business. It's all about, okay, what am I buying for my dollar here?
Right. People only buy for three reasons: make money, save money, or mitigate risk. Right. So, you're spot on that the revenue needs to be tied to that number. And I'm glad you called that out, because, you're right. If they don't see a return on investment, they're never going to execute. I think part of where the risk story does help reinforce it, though, is help them understand, hey, yeah, that might be a big number or a small number, but it's a number that if the impact hits, probably will cost you 10x what it's going to cost you to do it. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
That would be the biggest sales tool, right? Is if you can quantify that risk with real numbers. And I think that's something that we're going to see more of as we move forward in this kind of.
I'm rolling my eyes here, Gurnee, because people have been trying to quantify that with numbers for decades.
I know.
And I think it's useful to put things in numbers because it helps engage a part of the brain where things seem real, right?
Right.
Sometimes when you just put colors there, it's too emotional. And sometimes we want the rational mind. But the reality is those numbers are all guesswork, right? And
That's the problem with building out the solution, right? It's all guessing.
The other problem, and I'm sure you've encountered it too, Matt, is sometimes customers are not forthcoming to share revenue numbers and cost numbers, so you can actually get down to what these risks are really going to cost them in the long term. It depends on how deep a relationship you've built with that client.
Yeah.
Well, we've had some. We already had some questions come in, and I'd like to go through some of those. Anybody who's listening currently, you do have a questions tab on your GoToWebinar interface there. If you have some questions for our crew here, feel free to go ahead and type those out, and we'll go ahead and answer those live here. The first question that we had come in was, from your guys' thoughts and opinions, which compliance use cases do you think are most common, or what are we seeing out there?
We talked a lot about general use cases, but in terms of, hey, what are the specific drivers right now? Number one is insurance. And it used to be, if you filled out the right check boxes in that form and you did not lie, right? You were good. You got your policy, you were protected, right? And these days, unfortunately, those insurance forms are a bit of a trap. They are built to get you to lie, and they are built to get you to fall down. And when it comes to a loss claim, the claims process is built to deny your claim. And that's changed over the last 5 years. And I know people expect that from insurers sometimes, but the cyber formula has really changed. And um, being compliant with practice and being able to prove it is critical if you're going to defend an insurance claim. So that's
Yeah,
across
that's
every
good.
industry, right?
Yep.
And then of course this year is the year of CMMC, right? So if you're selling to the defense industrial base, there's a lot of noise this year. This is the first enforcement year, right? But I think largely it depends on your vertical. It depends on who your clients are. I'm in like the compliance space, which means I deal with countries all over the world and all sorts of states and every single vertical. And the reality is it depends. But I think the
Great old, it depends.
insurance and CMMC are the biggest drivers here in the US this year. But certainly we're seeing there's a new NIST 2 update that just came out. It hasn't shaken the tree yet, but it's about to shake the tree. We're about to see a big update to HIPAA, the largest update in about 15 years. So
Imagine that.
uh, that's going to be huge, but it hasn't landed yet. It's a few months out, and those are the big highlights I would point to.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I'd
any
say
thoughts, Brian?
I was going to say, kind of crossing over to the concept of cyber insurability is also a little bit of the shadow IT concerns too, right? You know, the reality is, where do these claims get rejected? Oh, it's when the marketing team doesn't tell IT that they're trying out a new app, and they've just taken all the customer name, email information, and all that privacy stuff and thrown it into that app that then gets exposed because it had no MFA on it, right? And now the claim is denied. So we're seeing that be another driver to, you know, kind of add on to what Matt shared there. And then I think you're just seeing also drivers where there are customers that have a, you know, conservative customers who have this bent that they just want to be better. They want to protect their customers, right? So if you're in that type of business that you are interacting with customer data, and if that customer data gets lost in any way, shape, or form, you could, you know, in essence, potentially go out of business just because of reputation loss. Those are businesses we're seeing stepping up. Compliance as another area that MSPs can explore, because they have a sensitivity to letting that data loose, and it really drives things that you might not see in other businesses that don't have that same requirement.
Yeah. Well, that really
All right.
leads into the next question there, Frank, right? In terms of how would you recommend structuring a compliance as a service, right? How do you make that a valuable ongoing element in addition to your standard tools, but now you need to kind of play into this offering?
But that's another one, Matt, that would be a full hour. Wouldn't you agree on its own?
Yeah, it depends. It depends is the answer.
Okay, that's a follow-up. We'll do that as a follow-up. But the quick elevator pitch, you're going up the elevator. What are the key elements to structure an offering?
Yeah.
I'll take a quick swipe. So it does depend on your target customer, their demography, vertical, and the requirements that impact them. All those things matter. So
Yeah.
you need to take those requirements, and you need to bake a service delivery pattern that gets someone to regulatory certainty. And there's no one size fits all there. And if you are a service provider that has not vertically targeted or horizontally bracketed, you're going to be ill-equipped to do it. So I mean, I think that the same things that make you a great MSP make this possible to achieve at a high level of scale and quality. All that said, the basic components up in the co-managed space, definitely risk assessments, right? You need to inform the client, and then you need to make sure you have an architectural pattern to follow up the risk assessment to continue to evidence, collect proof of practice, and make improvements, right? Down on the small business side, mostly you're informing your clients of their specific requirements and how they relate to them. How are they doing compared to others? How are they doing compared to the industry norms, and making sure that they acknowledge where they're at and make investments when they're supposed to, and be able to prove that all happened. So that's
Yeah.
the core.
Yeah.
And it's
Yep.
interesting because I think that when an MSP thinks about, you know, going down this road, what I feel like the first step really is to look towards partnering with cybersecurity consulting companies, or companies like yours, Matt, and using tools like what you have, Brian, because at the end of the day, like, you're not going to know it all enough in the beginning, right? Just like find those companies that can do that. I mean, Nodeware has IGI, things like that, where you can really work with a services company that has all this expertise already, and then you bring in small components of that, as you can bring in pieces of that puzzle into the MSP, start doing that until you can build that full practice. Would you guys agree with that kind of way of doing it?
I think that that's the right place to start. And for many service providers, it's a great way to build a growing service line in general. A sustainable growing service line is to find a partner that focuses on that, on the bringing the advisory and the regulatory expertise in, so that you could focus on the actual implementation and customer care.
Yeah, and MSPs have been doing that for a long time with their help desk outsourcing, with their SOC outsourcing, so this shouldn't feel any different to them from that perspective.
Yeah, 100%. And it's interesting because you talk to a lot of cybersecurity consulting firms, and they don't want to do any of the MSP work. They really want to stay in their lane and just do cybersecurity consulting, So it makes it a nice opportunity for the MSP to potentially work with that company. And what they end up seeing is more MSP business from it as well. So it kind of goes hand in hand, and I think it's a good way to get started, at least down this road. Some additional questions that came up. How do you guys think that SMB or MSPs can stay up to date with the latest compliance stuff in general?
I wish there was an easy answer to that one. So if you're in a vertical, right, there are leaders in your vertical that you can follow, and they will inform you, and you just need to pay attention. But if you're cross verticals, you really need to count on that partner that's in the cyber and privacy advisory space to inform you, because I hear about new framework changes like multiple times a week, and I don't have them all, and there's no single place to look. So you really need that outside expertise, so that that advisory firm that knows what vertical you're in, that knows what state you're in, can tell you about the changes as they're happening.
Yeah. Well, funny enough, places like Reddit, right? I mean, are good places to keep up to date on some of those changes. There's definitely groups amongst those types of places that you can follow.
Reddit, LinkedIn groups, and when in doubt, too, set up a Google alert for certain keywords too. I mean, it's going to flood your inbox, but set up a special inbox just for that, and that's one way you can keep on top of it. But to Matt's point, there's so many frameworks out there, and even those of us that are in the business, we're trying to keep track on all those frameworks. We're trying to make our updates to make them, usable for our clients. But there's always going to be one or two that might slip through if they're not the primary, and we really need to focus and look at those partners out there that can bring us expertise, and also, not be ashamed to raise your hand. Right. All of this is community based and helping out one another. That's why those information sharing organizations exist, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, there's it comes down to, don't be afraid to ask, right? You as an MSP are not the only one that doesn't know the answers and nobody's going to be current, right? That's not their job to be current. That's not their core competency that they're delivering on. So
yeah, unless you have specialists on your roster that can handle every one of those frameworks, and that's all they're responsible for, it's going to be really tough.
I haven't met that organization yet, Brian.
No, nor have I. Even at the big scale, right? The ones we were talking about.
So we had one last question, and really this comes down to kind of government and, obviously CISA is the government organization around, a lot of this compliance, but, efforts around deregulation or deregulating, how do you guys think that's going to impact compliance programs, if any?
I'm going to flip that around to a wish list. So frequently we end up with laws that are poorly written and that become onerous. So I think that deregulation in this space can be dangerous if it's not done thoughtfully. I think but the reality is, every administration that's gone through the White House in the last 2.5 decades has had a cyber angle, and they've all failed. right? They've all failed to really make substantial changes or impacts. And I think the biggest thing that we need from our government is we do need less technical requirements, and we need more attention to the types of law that allows people to escape accountability. So we live in a liability-based legal system. Yet despite that, we don't have great ways of determining who's at fault when it comes to cyber. So my wish is we get rid of all of the specific requirements that are technical and we replace them with a really great way of proving who didn't do the right thing, because that's the way the
Right.
US legal system works.
Take away the gray areas, right? Which is it's pretty much all of them, because what I hear a lot is best effort. That's one of those words, combination of words I hear all the time, right? That at the end of the day could get you in a lot of trouble. But or I didn't know, right? I didn't know I was supposed to be using those tools or doing this. Well, maybe that's not good enough. Brian, any
Yeah.
thoughts there?
Yeah, I just come back to one of the biggest challenges when it comes to regulation is it tends to move slower than the cyber landscape does, right? So we're not addressing the issues of today. We're still solving for the issues of the past. I mean, Matt, I cringe when you said it, but it's so true. HIPAA really hasn't been updated in 15 years. And think about how the technology landscape has changed too. So if you're really going to look at things that you want to try to progress a little bit fast and move some of the red tape, I think they've got to look at those security organizations to do so. And whether this administration will do it or others, that's not the debate I want to get into today, but we have to look at a way to be a little bit more rapid to protect, the privacy of our nation.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. Brian, why don't you give us a little elevator pitch on vCIOToolbox and tell everyone where we can learn a little bit more about your solution.
Sure. So vCIOToolbox, as I mentioned earlier, is a unified account management advisory platform. We've got two sides of the platform: the vCIO stack, which really focuses on you staying engaged with your customer throughout the year, both through business reviews and customer feedback. And then that unifies with our GRC tools, where we're able to go in and do assessment planning or framework assessments with your customers, manage risk, and review policy and work on policy management as well. All of this comes together in a single unified roadmap, single unified risk register with an overarching strategy for each client. And where you can get some more information, you mentioned a little bit about how to build a vCISO program in indirect ways today. If you go right out to our main webpage, we do have our take and our guide on what those responsibilities look like and how you potentially could package a vCISO program. So if you go out just right to the main vCIOToolbox site, you'll be able to get to that.
Awesome. And did you have a famous Frank that you aligned with?
Famous Frank, man. So I got to say Sinatra. Come on, we were
Oh,
talking a little bit about the pasta earlier, and candidly, my wedding song is Summer Wind. So God forbid I forget Sinatra.
Are you going to give us a little taste of something? No.
Oh God, no! You don't want me to give you a taste of anything. I heard about Frank and karaoke, and I will only do that in a group.
After a long night of multiple beverages.
Exactly.
Tell us a little bit about FortMesa and where people can learn more and get info for you.
Yeah, I gotta say I went to Sinatra too, but I figured I couldn't steal them from the Italians. But
Right.
so FortMesa is here to help us IT service providers build advanced cybersecurity delivery patterns and prove it. So we've got a bunch of software and partner success services around pre-marketing, around the sales cycle, around project management. We work across dozens of cybersecurity baselines, and that's it's a really exciting year to be in that space.
Absolutely. Well, guys, we really
Frank,
appreciate all of your expertise.
Let's not forget giving a quick ep on Nodeware as well. We got to promote ourselves a little bit.
I was, Frank. Don't worry. I just wanted to make sure I gave you a shout out. Thank you for being on our podcast today. Absolutely, Frank and myself are, of course, from Nodeware, and Nodeware is a amazing vulnerability management tool that allows you to provide vulnerability management for all of your clients from compliance and non-compliance. So every single client could use that proactive approach. With that, You can find our information as well as information on Brian and Matt's companies at nodeware.com/frankly speaking. So if you go there, you can find additional information, as well as we're going to be updating that page to have additional shows and some of our previous recordings and that sort of thing, and links and all kinds of fun stuff. So with that, from Frank and myself, we really appreciate everyone being here today. Thank you so much. And until next time, take care, guys.
See you guys.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.